The town of Red Rock wasn't a place you found by choice. It was a place you ended up. It clung to the barren plains of the West like a scab on a wound, baked into existence by a sun that knew no mercy. The wind was a constant thief, stealing moisture from the cracked earth and grit from the single, wide street to deposit it in the eyes and teeth of its inhabitants. The ground itself was a map of thirst, a web of fissures that snaked between the sun-bleached, false-fronted buildings, the saloon, the general store, the smithy, and the sheriff's office. What passed for a town, all slumped under the oppressive weight of the heat, their wood warped and weary. Life here was pared down to its essentials: water, shelter, and a quick hand. Hope was a currency scarcer than gold. At the very end of the dusty trail, where the town gave up and the unforgiving wilderness began, stood a cabin. It was built of thick, dark logs, more fortress than home, with a low roof and narrow windows that looked out like suspicious eyes. This was the domain of Jedediah Kane. Jedediah was not a man of the town, but a shadow that loomed over it. They called him many things in hushed tones over warm beer and cheap whiskey, but never to his face. They spoke of the Black Creek Massacre, of a time when his name was whispered with the same fear reserved for plagues and droughts. They said he had ridden with gangs that made the devil himself look like a choir boy. They pointed to the way he walked, a slight, almost imperceptible limp, the kind a man gets from a bullet that decided to stay, and the web of scars that marked him. A thin, white line tugged at the corner of his left eye, giving him a permanent, unnerving squint. His knuckles were thick and flattened, the knuckles of a man who had settled more arguments with his fists than his words. Now, he lived in silence. He was a ghost of his own violent past, a great wounded bear that had retreated to its lair to lick its wounds in solitude. He hunted for his own meat, kept his own counsel, and his only regular trips into Red Rock were to the general store for flour, salt, and bullets. On those occasions, a stillness would fall over the street. Men would find sudden interest in the contents of shop windows. Mothers would pull their children a little closer, and the saloon doors would swing shut with a soft finality. He never spoke more than was necessary, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to come from a deep, unused well. He bought what he needed, paid in coin, and left, his presence lingering like the smell of ozone after a lightning strike. The town feared him, not for what he did now, but for what they knew he was capable of doing. He was the most feared man in town, and he was profoundly, utterly alone. It was on a Tuesday, when the heat was so thick it felt like you were breathing through a wool blanket, that she appeared. She didn't ride in on a wagon or a tired horse. She walked. She walked as if she had been walking for 100 years, a slow, shuffling gait that spoke of bones that ached with a weariness too deep for sleep to cure. She was a wisp of a thing, lost inside a faded gray calico dress that had been mended so many times it was more patch than fabric. A drab bonnet shadowed her face, but it couldn't hide the stark geography of her life. She was thin to the point of being gaunt, her cheekbones sharp angles under taut skin. Her face was not pretty. It was a testament to survival. A faint, intricate latticework of tiny scars patterned her cheeks and forehead, the cruel signature of a childhood fever that had spared her life but stolen her looks. Her hands, clasped before her, were not the hands of a lady. They were red, chapped, and scored with the fine. Deep lines of hard labor, of lye soap, splintered wood, and rough soil. She was a woman who had been used up by the world and left with nothing but the dust on her worn-out shoes. She asked for directions at the general store, her voice so quiet the proprietor had to lean in to hear it over the buzzing of flies. The name she spoke, Jedediah Kane, caused the man to straighten up, his eyes narrowing with a mixture of suspicion and pity. He gave the directions curtly, pointing a thick finger toward the end of the trail, and watched her go, shaking his head. Abigail, for that was her name, though no one in Red Rock knew it, walked the length of the town, her gaze fixed on the dirt path before her, immune to the curious stares that followed her. She was a widow, though she wore no black. She had buried a husband taken by cholera and a baby daughter stolen by a fever in a nameless patch of land 2 states away. She had nothing left to her name but the dress on her back and a stubborn refusal to lie down and die. She had heard the stories of Jedediah Cain, heard them in a town a week's walk back. They said he was a devil. They said he was a killer. But they also said he lived alone and paid for his goods in cash, which meant he might have a need. And need was the only thing Abigail had to offer. She stopped before the dark log cabin. It looked even more forbidding up close. There was no garden, no sign of life save for a thin curl of smoke rising from the stone chimney. For a long moment, she stood there, the dry wind whipping the frayed hem of her dress against her ankles. She was afraid, but the fear of starving was a sharper, more immediate thing than the fear of a man. Even this man. She took a breath that tasted of dust and resolve, walked to the heavy plank door, and knocked. Her knock was so soft, so tentative, it was almost lost to the wind. The silence that followed stretched on. She was about to turn away, to accept this final defeat, when the door creaked open a few inches. A sliver of shadow appeared, and in it, a single, piercing blue eye. It was a cold eye, the color of a winter sky, and it sized her up in an instant, taking in the worn dress, the thin frame, the scarred face. "What do you want?" The voice was a rasp, unused and hostile. Abigail's heart hammered against her ribs, but she held her ground. She had practiced the words all morning, rehearsing them with each weary step. "Sir," she began, her own voice trembling slightly. I'm looking for work. I was told you live alone. I can keep house. I can clean." She paused, took another shallow breath, and offered the only thing of value she possessed. "I can cook." The eye in the darkness blinked, slow and dismissive. "I don't need help." The door started to close. Panic seized her. This was her last chance. The words tumbled out of her, unpracticed and raw with desperation. A final, humble plea. "I'm not pretty, sir, but I can cook." She said it not as an apology, but as a simple, unadorned fact. It was a truth as plain and solid as the cracked earth beneath her feet. She was not offering beauty, or companionship, or charm. She was offering sustenance. She was offering skill. "I don't ask for wages," she rushed on, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "Just a place to sleep, a roof. I won't be any trouble." The door stopped moving. The silence returned. But this time it was different. It was considering. From the sliver of darkness, she could feel his gaze on her, a heavy, assessing weight. He was looking at her, really looking, and seeing not a woman, but a bargain, a problem and its potential solution. Finally, the door swung open. Jedediah Cain stood before her in full view, and he was every bit as intimidating as the stories claimed. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man, the kind who had to duck through most doorways. His dark hair was shaggy, his face shadowed with a day's worth of stubble. He wore a simple homespun shirt and canvas trousers, but a large Colt revolver was holstered at his hip, its presence as natural as another limb. He looked from her face, with its map of scars, down to her calloused, work-worn hands, and then back up again. Her statement hung in the air between them. "I'm not pretty, but I can cook." It was the strangest, most honest proposition he had ever heard, in a world of liars, cheats, and people who always wanted something more than what they asked for. Her stark humility was a surprise. It cut through the layers of his own cynicism like a sharp knife. He was a terrible cook. He ate burned bacon and half-cooked beans, food for fuel and nothing more. The thought of a decent meal, of a warm stew on a cold night, was a long-forgotten luxury. "All right," he said, the words sounding like a stone being dragged over gravel. He stepped back, a silent invitation for her to enter. "One corner of the room is yours. You cook, you clean, you keep to yourself." He leveled a hard gaze at her, His winter blue eyes narrowed. "And one rule. We don't talk about the past. Not mine, not yours. What happened before you knocked on this door stays out there in the dust. Understand?" Abigail nodded, a wave of relief so profound it almost buckled her knees. "I understand. Sir, thank you." She stepped over the threshold, out of the blinding, unforgiving sun and into the cool, dark interior of the cabin. The deal was struck, a silent, brittle contract between two broken people, standing on the edge of the world. The cabin was as stark and unwelcoming as the man himself. It was a single large room, dominated by a huge stone hearth at one end, a rough-hewn table with 2 stools, a hard-looking bed in one corner, and a few shelves holding tins and sacks were the only furnishings. The air was thick with the scent of stale wood smoke, gun oil, and solitude. It was a man's space, functional and devoid of any comfort or warmth. Abigail set to work immediately. She didn't own a single possession to put in her corner, so she claimed it simply by sweeping it clean. She found a broom made of bound twigs and began to attack the layers of dust that coated every surface. Then she turned her attention to the hearth. It was the heart of any home, and this one was cold and neglected. The iron pots were coated with a layer of old grease, the ashes piled high. Jedediah watched her for a while from his stool, his expression unreadable. He watched her scrub the pots with sand and water until they shone a dull gray. He watched her haul wood from the pile outside, her thin arms straining with the effort, but she never asked for help. He watched her build a fire, her movements sure and practiced, coaxing a small, steady flame to life. He said nothing. When she began to inspect the meager contents of his shelves, a sack of flour, a tin of beans, some salted pork, he simply grunted and tossed a few coins onto the table. "Get what you need," he said. And then he took his rifle from the wall and disappeared out the door. For the first time in days, Abigail was alone and safe. She took the coins and walked back to the general store, her head held a little higher this time. She ignored the renewed whispers that followed her, the suspicious glances from the proprietor. She bought potatoes, onions, a small bag of dried herbs, and a precious slab of butter. When Jedediah returned at dusk, a brace of rabbits slung over his shoulder. The cabin was transformed. The floor was swept clean. The fire was crackling warmly in the hearth. And the air, instead of smelling of loneliness, was filled with the rich, savory aroma of rabbit stew. A loaf of passable-looking bread was cooling on the hearthstone. A candle, one she had bought with a spare penny, cast a soft, flickering glow over the table. He stopped in the doorway, momentarily thrown. The place looked different. It felt different, warmer, alive. Abigail was stirring the pot, her face flushed from the heat of the fire. She didn't look at him. "Supper's ready, sir," she said quietly. They ate in silence, as they would for many weeks to come. He was a man of few words, and she was a woman who had learned that silence was safety. But the food spoke for them. The stew was rich and flavorful, the vegetables soft, the meat falling from the bone. The bread was dense but wholesome. Jedediah ate 2 full bowls, his movements methodical, but for the first time in years, he tasted his food. He tasted the care that went into it. And so their life fell into a strange, silent rhythm. She would rise before dawn, rekindle the fire, and put coffee on to boil. The smell of it would wake him. He would eat the breakfast she laid out, biscuits and gravy, or fried salt pork, before taking his rifle and disappearing into the hills for the day. She would spend her days in a quiet flurry of domesticity. She cleaned the cabin until the wood floors gleamed. She washed his few shirts in a bucket with harsh lye soap and hung them to dry in the relentless wind. She learned the landscape around the cabin, finding patches of wild greens and bitter herbs to add to her cooking. The cabin, once a cold shell, began to slowly, almost imperceptibly, accumulate the small signs of a life being lived within it. a jar of wildflowers on the windowsill, a braided rag rug before the hearth. It was becoming a home. The town, of course, noticed. The whispers grew louder. "What's a woman like that doing with Jedediah Kane?" one woman would murmur to another over the pickle barrel at the general store. "She's plain as a mud fence. Can't be for her looks," another would reply, her voice laced with scorn. "Thinks she can tame him, I'd wager," a man would chuckle at the saloon. "More fool her, a wolf's a wolf." Abigail heard the talk. She felt the eyes on her back when she went to town, but she paid them no mind. Their words were just noise, like the wind. They did not know the quiet satisfaction of a full belly, or the profound peace of a solid roof over one's head. She had her small, safe world within the four walls of that cabin, and she guarded it fiercely by keeping her head down, her mouth shut, and her hands busy. Jedediah was changing, too, though he would have died before admitting it. He found himself lingering a little longer over his morning coffee. He started coming back from his hunting a little earlier, drawn by the promise of a warm meal. He stopped eating with his back to the wall, and instead sat across the table from her. He never spoke of personal matters, never broke his one rule, but he would watch her. He watched her mend his shirt with tiny, neat stitches. He watched her set aside scraps of food for a stray cat that had started appearing at the back door. He watched the quiet, efficient grace of her movements as she moved about the cabin. She was like a small, brown bird, constantly in motion, yet making almost no sound. One night, the weather turned. The sky, which had been a clear, endless blue for months, bruised to a dark purple. The wind began to howl, and then came a sound like 1,000 angry fists hammering on the roof. Hail. Not small pellets, but chunks of ice the size of birds' eggs, crashing down with a furious, deafening roar. Inside, the cabin was an island in the storm. The fire roared in the hearth, pushing back against the sudden, bone-deep chill that had seeped through the log walls. Abigail had been tidying up after supper, her movements a little slower than usual. As the storm hit its peak, a violent shiver racked her thin frame. She dropped the dishcloth she was holding and swayed, her hand flying to her forehead. "You all right?" Jedediah's voice cut through the noise of the storm. "Just a little cold, sir," she mumbled, but her face was unnaturally flushed, her eyes overly bright. She took a staggering step towards her corner and crumpled to the floor in a heap of gray calico. Jedediah was on his feet in an instant. He knelt beside her, his big, calloused hand hovering uncertainly over her shoulder before coming to rest on her forehead. She was burning up. Her skin was dry and hot as a furnace. Her breath came in shallow, ragged gasps. It was a fever, a bad one, come on as quickly and violently as the storm outside. For a moment, he was frozen. He knew how to deal with bullet wounds, knife cuts, and broken bones. He knew nothing of this, but leaving her on the cold floor was not an option. With a low curse, he scooped her up into his arms. She was shockingly light, a bundle of twigs and fevered heat. Her head lolled back against his shoulder, a low moan escaping her lips. As he carried her across the small room, he was struck by the intimacy of the act. This was the first time he had touched her. He had lived under the same roof with this woman for months, yet they had maintained a careful, unspoken distance. Now, he held her frail, unconscious body against his own. It was a contact born not of desire or violence, but of a raw, unfamiliar surge of concern. It was a terrifying feeling. He carried her to his own bed, the only bed in the cabin, and gently laid her down. He pulled the rough wool blanket up to her chin, his movements clumsy and unpracticed. He stood there for a long time, looking down at her, a pale, scarred face lost in his pillows, while the storm raged outside and a different, quieter storm began to brew within the walls of his heart. The first thing Abigail felt was softness, not the lumpy straw of her pallet, but a real mattress. yielding beneath her slight weight. The second was the scent, not the familiar smell of yeast and herbs from her kitchen corner, but something else entirely. Wood smoke, leather, and a faint, masculine scent of sage and wind. It was the scent of him. Her eyes fluttered open. The morning light was muted, filtering through the cabin's single, greasy window pane. She was not in her corner. She was in his bed, the dark wood of the headboard looming over her. A thick wool blanket, impossibly heavy and warm, was tucked around her chin. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through the fever's lingering haze. She tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness pushed her back down into the pillow. Her limbs felt like water, her head a leaden weight. "Stay put." The voice came from the shadows near the hearth. She turned her head slowly. Jedediah was sitting on a stool, cleaning his revolver with an oiled rag. His movements slow and deliberate. He wasn't looking at her, but she knew he was aware of her every breath. The memory of the storm, the sudden chill, and then nothing, came back to her in disjointed fragments. He must have carried her here. The thought sent a flush of heat to her face that had nothing to do with the fever. I am sorry, sir," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "I should get up. I must make breakfast." He stopped his work, setting the gun and rag aside with unnerving care. He rose and walked to the hearth, ladling something from a pot into a bowl. He brought it to the bedside. It was a thin, clear broth, steam rising from its surface. He didn't offer to help her, just placed it on the small crate he used as a nightstand. "You'll do no such thing," he said, his tone flat and non-negotiable. "You collapsed. Fever." She looked from the bowl to his impassive face, confusion warring with the deep-seated instinct to be useful. She was failing her side of their bargain. "I must work to earn my keep, sir." He finally met her gaze, his blue eyes as cold and clear as ice on a winter creek. For a moment, she thought she saw a flicker of something else in their depths, something other than anger or indifference, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. He loomed over her, a mountain of a man, and for all his stillness, she could feel the discomfort rolling off him in waves. He was a man at home with violence and solitude, not with nursing a sick woman in his own bed. He gave a short, sharp sigh, a sound of profound irritation. "The deal was you cook. You can't cook if you're dead." He turned his back on her and walked back to his stool, picking up his gun as if it were a shield. "So don't die." The words were blunt, almost cruel, but they landed on Abigail's ears with a strange sort of comfort. It was his way. He wasn't offering sympathy. He was stating a practical fact. Her utility was her only value, and he was ordering her to preserve it. In his own harsh, broken language, he was telling her to get well. She picked up the bowl, her hands trembling, and sipped the broth. It was simple, just water and salt and the essence of rabbit. But it was the warmest thing she had ever tasted. For 3 days, the world was confined to that bed. The fever ebbed and flowed, leaving her weak and drenched in sweat. Through it all, Jedediah was a constant, silent presence. He never spoke unless necessary. He would leave broth for her, a dipper of fresh water, and then retreat to the far side of the cabin, cleaning his tack or sharpening his knives, filling the space with small, purposeful sounds that kept the oppressive silence at bay. The roles were reversed. She, who had brought life and warmth into his home, was now utterly dependent, and he, who had kept the world at arm's length, was now a reluctant caretaker. It was a fragile, awkward truce, held in the quiet space between a sick woman and a man who didn't know the first thing about gentleness. When the fever finally broke and she was able to stand on shaky legs, the silent rhythm of their lives resumed. But something had fundamentally shifted. The line between his space and her space, once so stark and clear, had been blurred. Jedediah began to change in ways so subtle they were almost imperceptible. He had always eaten like a man for whom food was merely fuel, but now he lingered at the table. He would watch her as she served the stew, his eyes following the steam as it rose from the bowl. He started taking a second biscuit, wiping the plate clean with it to sop up the last of the gravy. He ate more, as if her brief illness had reminded him of the emptiness of his own cooking, the sheer loneliness of it. In the evenings, after the dishes were washed and the fire banked, Abigail had a small ritual. She would kneel in her corner, her back to him, and her lips would move in a silent, whispered prayer. She prayed for the souls of her lost husband and child, a quiet conversation with a God she hoped was still listening, even out here in this forgotten land. In the beginning, Jedediah had ignored it, treating it as another of her quiet, harmless habits. But now, he would sit at the table, a cooling cup of coffee in his hands, and he would listen. He could not make out the words, only the soft, rhythmic cadence of her voice, a gentle murmur against the vast, howling silence of the prairie night. It was a sound of faith in a world that had given him none, a sound of peace in a life that had known only turmoil. It did not move him to believe, but it settled something in him, like dust settling after a stampede. He started to notice the small things, the quiet details of her existence. He watched from the cabin door as she foraged near the creek bed, her movements precise as she plucked the tender leaves of wild sorrel, leaving the roots untouched so the plant would grow again. He saw the way she saved every crumb from the bread she baked, putting them on the windowsill for the sparrows. He watched her coax the skinny, feral cat, the one with the torn ear, closer to the back door each day, first with a scrap of meat, then with a saucer of precious milk she'd traded an egg for in town. Jedediah Kane was a man who had lived by taking. He had taken lives, taken money, taken what he wanted because he was stronger. He understood the simple, brutal arithmetic of the predator. But Abigail operated by a different math entirely. She was a nurturer, a preserver, in a land that was defined by its harshness and scarcity. She found ways to create and to give. He watched her gentle patience with the wildcat, and for the first time, he wondered if he was just another stray she was trying to save. The thought was so absurd, so dangerously soft, that he pushed it away with a scowl and went back to cleaning his rifle. One night, he returned late from tracking a buck. The moon was high and cold, casting long, skeletal shadows across the plains. He expected to find the cabin dark, Abigail asleep on her pallet. Instead, a low light flickered from the window. He entered silently, his moccasins making no sound on the floorboards. Abigail was not asleep. She was sitting on the floor before the hearth, where the fire had burned down to a bed of glowing, orange embers. Her arms were wrapped around her knees, and she was staring into the dying light, her body trembling with silent sobs. She made no sound, but he could see the grief shaking her small frame, a deep, silent earthquake of the soul. The Jedediah of old would have turned and left. He would have gone back outside, slept under the stars, done anything to avoid this raw, naked display of emotion. It was not his concern. It was her past, the one they had sworn never to speak of. But his feet remained rooted to the floor. He saw not just a crying woman, but the absolute desolation in her posture, the profound loneliness of her sorrow. It was a loneliness he recognized, for he lived with its twin every single day. He didn't know the words for comfort. They were a foreign language he had never learned. So he did the only thing he could think to do. He moved to the hearth, took the kettle from its hook, and poured hot water into a tin cup. He walked over to her, his shadow falling over her trembling form. She didn't seem to notice him until he was right behind her. He didn't speak. He simply knelt and held out the cup. Abigail started, her head snapping up. Her face was slick with tears in the firelight, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and surprise at his sudden proximity. She looked at the cup, then up at his grim, unreadable face. Hesitantly, she took it, her cold fingers brushing against his. As she held the cup, he did something else, something that surprised them both. He reached out and placed his large, calloused hand on her shoulder. It was a heavy, solid weight. It wasn't a caress or a gesture of affection. It was an anchor, a silent acknowledgement. I am here. You are not alone in this room. He stayed like that for a long moment, his hand on her shoulder, the two of them kneeling in the dying light of the fire. He could feel the fine bones beneath her thin dress, the tremors of her weeping slowly subsiding under his touch. He said nothing, and in the vast, echoing silence of the cabin, his silence was more eloquent than 1,000 empty words. Finally, he withdrew his hand, stood up, and went to his bed, leaving her with a warm cup clutched in her hands. She cried for a long time after that, but her tears were different now, no longer just for the husband and child she had lost, but for the unexpected, stunning kindness of the man she had found. The next morning, Abigail rose before the sun, her eyes puffy but her spirit settled. There was a new understanding between them, a fragile bridge built across the chasm of their unspoken pasts. She wanted to thank him, but she knew words would only make him retreat into his shell, so she spoke to him in her own language. She took out the last of the pumpkins she had stored for winter and a precious handful of molasses. By the time Jedediah awoke to the smell of coffee, another aroma was filling the cabin, a warm, sweet, spicy scent of cinnamon, nutmeg, and baking pumpkin. It was a smell that cut through the years, bypassing the hardened gunslinger and striking something deep within the man. When he came to the table, a thick slice of dark orange pumpkin bread sat on his plate, steam rising from its tender crumb. He stopped and stared at it. It was the bread his mother used to make, on cold autumn mornings just like this one. Back in a life he had burned to the ground so long ago he could barely remember the flames. He sat down and ate the bread slowly, deliberately. Each bite was a ghost, a memory of a time when his hands were not stained with blood, a time when a mother's love was the most powerful force in his world. He did not look at Abigail, and she did not look at him, but as he ate the bread she had made, a silent conversation took place. A thank you and a you're welcome passed between them in the language of shared solitude and warm pumpkin bread. The walls between them, already weakened, began to crumble further. Their silence was no longer empty, but filled with a growing awareness. Glances held for a heartbeat too long across the dinner table. His fingers would brush hers as he took a plate from her, sending a jolt of surprising warmth through them both. They were two planets that had been orbiting each other at a safe distance, now pulled by a slow, inexorable gravity into a closer, more dangerous alignment. He found himself noticing the way a stray strand of her brown hair would catch the light, the quiet determination in her scarred profile as she concentrated on her sewing. She found herself listening for the sound of his footsteps returning at the end of the day, her heart giving a small, traitorous leap when she heard them. It was a terrifying, exhilarating feeling for them both, a fragile green shoot pushing its way up through scorched earth. The inevitable collision came on a Saturday, in the heart of Red Rock. Abigail was in the general store, trading the last of her eggs for a sack of flour. The store was crowded, filled with ranchers and townsfolk. One of them was Cletus Miller, a big slovenly man with whiskey on his breath and malice in his piggy eyes. He saw Abigail, plain and alone, and saw an easy target for his drunken amusement. "Well now, look what we have here," Cletus boomed, blocking her path as she tried to leave. "If it ain't the killer's canary, what's a man like Cain want with a scrawny little bird like you?" Abigail ignored him, her chin held high, and tried to step around him. He moved to block her again, a smirk spreading across his unshaven face. "Too good to talk to me? I hear old Jedediah likes his women quiet. That what you are, quiet?" He reached out and grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her bicep. A collective gasp went through the store. Abigail froze, her heart hammering. "Let go of me," she said, her voice low and steady. "Or what?" Cletus sneered, pulling her closer. "Your man gonna come protect you." "I ain't scared of him." He was wrong. He should have been. One moment, Cletus was leering at her. The next, a shadow fell over them. Jedediah had been standing by the door, silent and unnoticed as always. He moved with a speed that was terrifying in a man his size. He didn't speak. He didn't issue a warning. His first punch was a short, brutal jab that snapped Cletus's head back with an audible crack. The second was a powerful right cross that landed squarely on the man's jaw. Cletus's eyes rolled back in his head, and he collapsed to the floorboards like a felled tree, unconscious before he even hit the ground. The store fell into a dead, shocked silence. Everyone stared, not at the heap on the floor, but at Jedediah. He stood over Cletus's body, his chest heaving slightly, his right hand clenched into a white-knuckled fist. This was the man from the stories, the killer they all whispered about. The violence had been shocking in its speed and its finality. But Abigail wasn't looking at the man on the floor. She was looking at Jedediah, and what she saw stole her breath. He slowly unclenched his fist and looked down at his own hand as if he'd never seen it before. Then he lifted his head and his eyes met hers. The cold, hard mask of the gunslinger was gone. In its place was a look of such raw, agonizing self-loathing that it made her want to cry out. His eyes were wide with a kind of horror, not at what he had done to Cletus, but at the fact that he had unleashed that part of himself in front of her. His hand, the one that had delivered the blows, was trembling. He looked like a man who had just come face to face with his own personal demon and was terrified by what he saw. In that one shattering moment, she saw past the fearsome reputation and glimpsed the broken man trapped inside. A man who hated the violence he was so terribly good at. He held her gaze for a second longer, his expression a maelstrom of guilt and regret. Then, without a word to her or anyone else, he turned and walked out of the store, disappearing into the harsh, unforgiving sunlight, leaving her standing amidst the wreckage of his fury, her heart aching not with fear, but with a sudden, overwhelming wave of compassion. The silence that followed the incident at the general store was a different creature from the one they had known before. It was no longer a comfortable, empty space between them, but a taut, humming wire. Jedediah was more withdrawn than ever, a thundercloud of a man brooding by the fire, his guilt a palpable presence in the small cabin. He barely spoke, and when he did, his voice was a low rasp, stripped of any inflection. He avoided her eyes, as if he couldn't bear the reflection of his own violence that he imagined he'd see there. Abigail, in turn, moved around him with a quiet, careful grace. She did not fear him. The sight of his trembling hand and the raw self-loathing in his eyes had slain any fear she might have felt. Instead, her heart was filled with a tender, aching compassion. She saw a man at war with himself, a man who hated the very strength that had allowed him to survive. And so, she gave him the gift of her quiet presence, making no demands, asking no questions. She just cooked and cleaned and mended, her steady, domestic rhythms a silent reassurance that the world had not ended, that the sun had risen again, and that supper would be on the table at dusk. In this charged new silence, Abigail began, tentatively at first, to claim the space in small, womanly ways. She had saved a few pennies from her careful marketing, and one afternoon, she returned from town with a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. That evening, when Jedediah sat down to eat, he stopped. The rough, knife-scored surface of the table was hidden beneath a piece of checkered red and white cotton cloth. It was a simple, cheap thing, already a little faded, but it was a tablecloth. It was a declaration. This was not just a place to eat. It was a table. This was not just a shelter. It was a home. He stared at it for a full minute, his expression unreadable. Abigail held her breath, her heart fluttering like a trapped bird. She feared he would be angry, that he would see it as an intrusion, a violation of his stark, masculine world. She watched as he slowly reached out and touched the corner of the cloth, his rough finger tracing one of the checkered squares. He said nothing, but when he sat down, he seemed to do so with a little more care, placing his tin plate on the cloth with a quiet reverence that spoke volumes. After that, the small changes continued. A jar of dried wildflowers appeared on the mantelpiece. She stitched a new cover for his lumpy pillow out of a soft piece of an old flour sack. She hung a string of dried onions and herbs from the rafters, their earthy scent mingling with the wood smoke. Each small act was a stitch, sewing a fragile tapestry of domesticity over the cabin's grim, bare bones. She was nesting, creating a place of softness and order in the heart of his wilderness. Jedediah never commented on any of it, but he noticed. He noticed everything, and in his silence, she read not disapproval, but a kind of weary, wondering acceptance. The fragile peace was shattered on a moonless night a few weeks later. Jedediah had been tense all day, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, a grim set to his jaw. He had taken both his rifle and his revolver when he left that morning, a sign that he was expecting more than just rabbits for dinner. He had not returned by the time the sun bled out across the western plains. Abigail ate her own small supper alone, her stomach a tight knot of anxiety. The hours crawled by. The fire burned low. She sat in the rocking chair she had dragged closer to the hearth, her mending lying forgotten in her lap, her ears straining for the sound of his footsteps. It was well past midnight when she heard it, not his steady tread, but a stumbling, dragging sound, followed by a heavy thud against the cabin door. She flew to it, her hands fumbling with the latch. The moment she pulled it open, he fell inward, collapsing over the threshold into the room. The coppery scent of blood, sharp and sickening, filled the air. Jedediah was a mess of torn cloth, dirt, and gore. A long, ugly gash ran from his temple down his cheek, welling with dark blood. His left sleeve was soaked through, a deeper, more ominous red. He was breathing in harsh, ragged gasps, his face pale and clammy in the firelight. "Sir, Jedediah!" she cried, his given name tumbling from her lips for the very first time. He pushed himself up onto one elbow, his teeth gritted in pain. "Get the door," he rasped, his voice a strained whisper. "Bar it." Forgetting her own fear, she did as he commanded, dropping the heavy wooden bar into its iron brackets. When she turned back, he had managed to drag himself to the table and was slumped in a chair, his head bowed, the rifle clattering from his numb fingers to the floor. "Water," he grunted. "And the whiskey." She moved with a sureness that surprised her. She brought him a dipper of water, which he drank greedily, and the bottle of whiskey he kept for medicinal purposes. Then she lit another lamp, her hands shaking but her purpose firm. "Let me see," she said, her voice soft but insistent. She gently took a damp cloth to the cut on his face, cleaning away the blood and grime. The gash was deep but clean. It was the wound on his arm that was the worst. She had to take his hunting knife and slit the sleeve from cuff to shoulder to get the fabric away from the raw, mangled flesh. A bullet had torn through the muscle of his forearm, leaving a ragged, angry wound that was still sluggishly bleeding. 3 other men had found him on the trail back, an old score, a blood debt from a life he was trying to leave behind. He had left them for the coyotes, but they had left their marks on him. Her stomach churned, but she forced the feeling down. She had seen death and sickness, but this was different. This was violence, fresh and brutal. She poured a generous amount of whiskey directly into the wound. Jedediah hissed, his whole body going rigid, a strangled groan escaping his lips. But he didn't pull away. As she worked, her trembling fingers cleaning and binding the wound, she became aware of him in a way she never had before. Her hands were on his skin. It was hot, feverish, and stretched taut over hard muscle. She had to lean in close, her hair brushing against his uninjured shoulder. The scent of him, blood, sweat, and earth, filling her senses. For the first time, she saw the landscape of his body, and it was a map of old wars, a puckered, star-shaped scar on his chest, barely visible in the opening of his torn shirt. a long, silvery line that snaked across his ribs, smaller, fainter marks on his hands and arms. Each scar was a story he would never tell, a ghost he outlived with every day. Her touch was gentle, almost reverent, as she wrapped the clean linen strips around his arm, her movements deft and sure. When she was finished, she stood back, her task complete. He was still slumped in the chair, his eyes closed, his breathing a little easier. The bleeding had stopped. She reached for the bloody rags on the table to clear them away, but as she did, his hands shot out and grabbed her wrist. His grip was surprisingly strong. His eyes opened and locked on hers. They were no longer cold and distant. They were dark, dilated with pain, and burning with a raw, desperate intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. He didn't speak. He just looked at her, a long, searching look that seemed to strip away every defense she had. Then he pulled. It wasn't a violent gesture, but it was inexorable. He pulled her forward until she stumbled, her free hand landing on his good shoulder to steady herself. She was bent over him, their faces inches apart. She could feel his ragged breath on her cheek, see the flicker of the lamplight reflected in the dark pools of his eyes. The air between them crackled, thick with unspoken things, with pain, with gratitude, with a desperate, aching loneliness that suddenly found its mirror. He slowly, deliberately, pulled her closer still, until her body was pressed against his, until her breasts were flattened against the hard wall of his chest. His gaze dropped to her mouth. She saw the conflict in his face, the war between the raw, animal need for comfort, for contact, and a lifetime of holding himself apart. He was a starving man, and she was the first glimpse of sustenance he had allowed himself in years. He leaned in, his lips parting slightly. They were a breath away from a kiss, a breath away from shattering the fragile, silent world they had built. Abigail's heart was a wild drum against her ribs. She didn't pull away. In that moment, she wanted it. She wanted the feel of his mouth on hers, the solid, living reality of him. But then, something shifted in his eyes. A shadow fell. The raw need was replaced by that familiar, agonizing self-loathing. He was looking at her, and at himself, and he saw a monster about to defile the only clean thing in its life. A muscle in his jaw clenched, with a shuddering breath that was almost a sob. He stopped. He loosened his grip on her wrist and pushed himself back in his chair, putting a small, vital space back between them. He turned his head away, breaking the contact, and stared into the fire. The moment was over. The wire had snapped. "Go to bed, Abigail," he said, his voice a raw, broken thing. She stood there for a moment, her own body trembling with the aftershock. Then, without a word, she turned and retreated to her corner, the ghost of his touch still burning on her skin. The next morning, the cabin was thick with an awkward, heavy tension. Jedediah was already awake when she rose, sitting at the table, his bandaged arm resting on the checkered cloth. He looked haggard, his face pale beneath his tan. He didn't look at her as she moved about, rekindling the fire and putting the coffee on. He began, his voice rough. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Last night, I apologize." Abigail stopped what she was doing and turned to face him. He was staring down at his hands, unable to meet her gaze. He looked like a boy being chastised, not the most feared man in town. A wave of tenderness washed over her. He thought he had frightened her. He thought he had ruined everything. She walked to the table and stood before him, waiting until he finally, reluctantly, lifted his head to look at her. His eyes were filled with shame. She gave him a small, sad smile. "Sir," she said, her voice soft and steady, "I told you once that I was not pretty, but that I could cook." She paused, letting the memory of her first day, her desperate plea, settle between them. "I will tell you something else now." She took a small breath. "I may not be pretty, but I know how to listen." Jedediah stared at her, his expression slowly changing from shame to stunned surprise. It was an offer of absolution, and more, it was an invitation. She wasn't just his cook, a set of hands to perform a function. She was offering him a place to put his ghosts, a quiet harbor for his pain. She was offering him solace. He searched her face, her plain, scarred face, and saw not pity, but a strength and a deep, quiet understanding that humbled him to his very core. He gave a single, jerky nod, unable to speak, but the tension in the room eased, replaced by a new, more profound connection. Life found its rhythm again, but it was a deeper melody now. A week later, a storm of biblical proportions rolled in from the north. The wind shrieked like a banshee, and the rain came down in solid, gray sheets, turning the world outside into a churning, watery chaos. In the middle of the night, they were jolted awake by a sound like the sky ripping in two, a deafening crack, followed by a splintering groan. A section of the sod roof, loosened by the deluge, had given way. Rain and wind poured into the cabin, dousing the fire and soaking everything in an instant. "The cellar!" Jedediah yelled over the roar of the storm. He lit a lantern, and by its swinging, frantic light, he led her to a trap door in the floor she had never even known was there. He pulled it open, revealing a set of steep wooden steps leading down into musty darkness. It was a small, earthen root cellar, cool and smelling of damp soil and potatoes. It was barely large enough for the two of them. They huddled together in the dark, the lantern casting huge, dancing shadows on the packed dirt walls. Above them, the storm raged, its fury muffled by the earth. The cold was intense, a damp, penetrating chill that seeped into their bones. They sat on an old wooden crate, their shoulders and hips pressed together for warmth. At first, they were stiff and formal, acutely aware of their proximity. But as the hours wore on and the cold deepened, they instinctively drew closer. Abigail was shivering uncontrollably, her teeth chattering. Without a word, Jedediah put his good arm around her, pulling her against his side. She leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder, too cold and exhausted to feel anything but a profound sense of gratitude for his warmth, his solid presence. They sat like that in the dark for a long time, listening to the storm. In the close, confined space, every small sound, every breath, was magnified. He could feel the fine tremors that ran through her body. He could smell the faint, clean scent of her hair. It was an intimacy more profound than the near kiss, a quiet sharing of vulnerability against the chaos of the outside world. At some point, his hand, which had been resting on her back, began to move. It was a slow, tentative exploration, his fingers tracing the seam of her worn calico dress. He was learning her shape in the darkness, the gentle curve of her waist, the sharp angle of her hip. His touch was feather-light, almost questioning. Abigail's breath hitched. A slow, liquid heat began to spread through her veins, pushing back the cold. His fingers found the frayed hem of her skirt, and for a moment, they rested there, on the verge of slipping beneath the cloth to find the skin of her ankle. The air grew thick with possibility, and then, just as before, he stopped. He drew his hand back, a deep, shuddering sigh escaping him. He tucked his hand between his own body and hers. A deliberate retreat. This time, Abigail understood, lying there in the dark, pressed against his side. She finally understood the true nature of his war with himself. It wasn't that he didn't want her. It was that he wanted to protect her, even from himself. He saw himself as a blight, a force of destruction. The fragile, gentle thing growing between them was something he treasured too much to risk crushing it with his own rough, hungry needs. His restraint was not a rejection. It was the highest form of respect he knew how to give. And as she lay there, listening to the steady beat of his heart beneath her ear, a feeling deeper and more powerful than she had ever known, for any man began to bloom in her chest. The storm passed by dawn. They emerged from the cellar into a world washed clean and utterly devastated. The hole in the roof was a gaping wound open to the gray sky. The next day, after he had temporarily patched the roof, she went about her work, her heart full of the knowledge from the night before. She wanted to make him something special, something hearty and warming. She decided on a savory meat pie, rich with beef and root vegetables and a thick, flaky crust. She seasoned it liberally with the cayenne pepper she'd bought, giving it a fiery kick she thought he might appreciate. She served it to him that evening, placing the steaming golden brown pie in the center of the checkered tablecloth. It smelled wonderful. She watched him, her face full of quiet anticipation, as he cut a large slice and put it on his plate. He lifted the first forkful to his mouth, and then he froze. He stared at the pie on his fork, his face draining of all color. A strange, haunted look came into his eyes. He slowly lowered the fork, his hand unsteady. He pushed the plate away from him, a small, violent shove. "I'm not hungry," he said, his voice flat and dead. He stood up, his chair scraping loudly on the floorboards, and walked out of the cabin, leaving Abigail alone at the table with the beautiful, steaming pie. A sudden, cold knot of confusion and hurt tightening in her chest. She had crossed a line she hadn't known existed, and the ghost of a memory she couldn't see had just slammed a door between them once more. The cold rejection of the meat pie hung in the cabin for days, a tangible chill that even the hearth fire couldn't dispel. Jedediah was a ghost in his own home, his silence heavier and more absolute than ever before. He ate what she cooked without comment, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the cabin walls. The fragile bridge of understanding they had built seemed to have been washed away, and Abigail was left stranded on the shore of her own confusion and hurt. She had trespassed, stumbled into a part of his past that was walled off and guarded, and she had no map to find her way back to the tentative peace they had shared. It was in this tense, quiet landscape that the past came calling, and it arrived in a swirl of crimson silk and the scent of lilacs. It was a blistering afternoon. Abigail was outside, turning a sheet on the clothesline, the rough fabric warm from the sun. A cloud of dust down the trail announced the arrival of a buggy. A fine, handsome thing pulled by a sleek black horse, a stark contrast to the tired mules and sway-backed nags usually seen in Red Rock. The buggy pulled up not in front of the town, but directly before their cabin. A woman descended, and she was, without question, the most beautiful creature Abigail had ever seen. She was tall and slender, with a cascade of fiery red hair piled artfully atop her head. Her skin was like porcelain, untouched by sun or hardship. Her dress was a deep crimson, the silk shimmering in the harsh light, a slash of defiant color against the drab browns and grays of the landscape. As she moved toward the cabin, a light, sweet fragrance of lilacs drifted on the dry wind, a scent so out of place in this world of dust and sage that it felt like an illusion. Jedediah, who had been splitting wood near the side of the cabin, froze mid-swing. He lowered the axe slowly, his body going rigid. The woman stopped a few feet from him, a slow, confident smile gracing her perfect, rose-colored lips. From her vantage point by the clothesline, Abigail became invisible. She was just another part of the scenery, a drab woman in a drab dress, blending into the sun-bleached wood and dusty earth. She could not hear their words, only watch the silent, tense tableau unfold. The woman in crimson spoke, her head tilted, her smile unwavering. She gestured with a gloved hand, a picture of practiced elegance. Jedediah remained still as a statue, his back to Abigail. He was a stone wall, but Abigail, who had learned to read the subtle shifts in his posture, could see the tension coiling in his shoulders, the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. Abigail's own hand stilled on the rough sheet. A cold, unfamiliar feeling began to seep into her heart. It was a feeling she had never had cause to know before. She had always known she was not pretty. It was a simple fact of her life, like the sky being blue or the ground being hard. Her scarred face and work-worn hands were part of who she was. She had never felt envy or resentment, only a quiet acceptance. But seeing this woman, this vision of flawless, effortless beauty, standing so close to Jedediah, a bitter seed of comparison took root and sprouted with shocking speed. She looked down at her own hands, at the chapped knuckles and the nails worn down to the quick. She thought of her face in the small, cracked piece of mirror she kept in her corner, the faint web of scars that the fever had left as its cruel souvenir. She was a sparrow, brown and plain. This woman was a cardinal, a flash of fire and brilliance. For the first time, Abigail felt a sharp, painful awareness of her own plainness, her own inadequacy. She felt common, trivial, a dull, gray thing in the presence of vibrant life. The woman belonged to the world Jedediah had come from, a world of saloons and silk, of danger and desire. Abigail belonged to a world of hearths and mending, of quiet survival. The conversation, if it could be called that, did not last long. Jedediah spoke, a single, sharp sentence that Abigail could not hear. The woman's smile faltered for the first time. She took a step closer, her hand reaching for his arm. He took a step back, a sharp, decisive movement of rejection. A flash of anger crossed the woman's beautiful face. She said something else, her voice tight and clipped, then turned on her heel, her silk dress swirling around her ankles, and marched back to the buggy. In moments, she was gone, leaving only a cloud of dust and the faint, alien scent of lilacs hanging in the air. Abigail's heart, which had been lodged in her throat, slowly sank. He had sent her away. A wave of relief, so profound it made her feel dizzy, washed over her. He had chosen the quiet of the cabin over the vibrant pull of his past. She waited for him to turn, to walk back to the cabin, for their world to right itself. But he didn't. Jedediah stood there for a long time, staring down the trail where the buggy had disappeared. Then, with a sudden, violent motion, he picked up the axe and slammed it into the splitting block, leaving it quivering there. He turned, but not toward the cabin. He strode past it, his long legs eating up the ground, and headed not for the hills where he hunted, but back toward the town, back toward the saloon. Abigail watched him go until he was just a small, dark figure swallowed by the dust and the distance. The sheet felt heavy and cold in her hands. He had sent the woman away, but he had run from the silence she left behind. He had run from the cabin. He had run from her. Night fell, thick and starless. Abigail did not light the main lamp, unwilling to make the cabin a welcoming beacon for a man who did not wish to be there. She sat in her chair by the hearth, where the fire had burned down to a single, stubborn log, a glowing heart in the darkness. She kept a single candle lit on the small table beside her, its flame a tiny, flickering point of hope in the vast, encroaching blackness. The hours ticked by, marked only by the shifting of the log in the grate and the lonely, mournful call of a coyote in the distant hills. She did not sleep. Her mind was a torrent of fears and anxieties. Had he gone with the woman? Was he lying drunk in the saloon? Or worse, was he lying in an alley, a knife in his back, his past having finally caught up with him for good? The silence of the cabin, once a comfort, was now a torment, amplifying every creak of the wood, every gust of wind against the walls. She thought of the meat pie. She had stirred up a ghost for him, and in his flight from that ghost, he had run straight into another. She felt a crushing weight of responsibility. She had built this fragile world of warmth and order, and she feared she had been the one to shatter it. She sat through the long, dark night, a solitary vigil keeper. Her universe shrunk to the small, wavering circle of candlelight, waiting, The first gray hint of dawn was staining the eastern sky when she heard it, the exhausted, uneven plod of a horse, followed by a fumbling at the door latch. She was on her feet in an instant, her body stiff from the long night. She pulled the bar and opened the door. Jedediah practically fell into the room. He was a wreck. His clothes were disheveled and stained, his hair a tangled mess. The smell of cheap, sour whiskey rolled off him in a suffocating wave. His eyes were bloodshot and unfocused. He took 2 stumbling steps into the cabin. His legs gave out, and he collapsed onto the floor by the hearth, a dead weight of drunkenness and despair. He was out cold. Abigail looked down at him, at the most feared man in town, reduced to this helpless, broken heap. There was no anger in her heart, no disgust. There was only a deep, bottomless well of sorrow. She saw the immense pain he carried, a burden so heavy that sometimes even he could not stand up beneath it. She barred the door again, then knelt beside him. She couldn't move him, so she made him as comfortable as she could, sliding a folded blanket under his head. His face was streaked with dirt and stubble. She went to the water bucket, dipped a clean cloth in the cool water, and wrung it out. She knelt by his side again and began to gently wash his face. Her movements were slow and tender. She cleaned the grime from his temples, from the harsh lines around his mouth, from the scar that tugged at the corner of his eye. He was so still, so vulnerable. The hard mask of the gunslinger was gone, replaced by the slack, unguarded features of a man lost in a drunken stupor. As she cleaned the dirt from his skin, a single tear escaped her eye and rolled down her cheek. It fell, a tiny, warm drop of salt and sorrow, and landed on his unshaven jaw, glistening in the pale morning light. She quickly wiped it away with the back of her hand, but it was too late. It had fallen, a silent offering, a baptism of grief. She stayed there, kneeling by his side as the cabin slowly filled with light, watching the troubled rise and fall of his chest. She must have dozed, her head nodding forward, because the next thing she knew, a hand was on her arm. Her eyes snapped open. Jedediah was awake. He had pushed himself up onto one elbow, his eyes bleary but clear, fixed on her face. He looked from her tired, worried expression down to the damp cloth still clutched in her hand. He touched his own jaw, right where her tear had fallen, as if he could still feel its phantom touch. He looked around the cabin, at the single burned-down candle, at the untouched bed, and he understood. She had waited up for him all night. He said nothing. He simply reached out his other hand and gently, firmly, took hold of her arm. He pulled her toward him, and she, exhausted and off balance, went, tumbling softly against his side. He shifted, moving with a surprising, fluid grace, until he was sitting up, his back against the stone of the hearth, pulling her with him. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, her back pressed against his chest, his chin resting on the top of her head. He held her like that for a long time, his arms a cage of warmth and security around her. Abigail sat perfectly still, her heart hammering. This was different from all the other times. This was not the brief, anchoring touch on the shoulder, not the clumsy, protective gesture in the storm cellar. This was a claiming, an embrace that said, "Stay." The sun was higher now, and a beam of light cut through the dusty air, illuminating the kitchen corner. The scent of yesterday's baking still lingered faintly in the air, the wholesome smell of bread, mingled with the sharp, acrid scent of cold ashes from the fire. It was the smell of their life, sustenance and ruin, side by side. Jedediah tightened his hold, and his voice, when he finally spoke, was a rough, broken whisper in her ear. "I'm sorry, Abigail." It was the first time he had ever used her name. The sound of it, in his voice, was a revelation. It made her real. He slowly turned her in his arms, his big, rough hands framing her face. He looked at her, his gaze intense and searching, as if he were trying to memorize every line, every scar. "I'm sorry," he said again. And this time it was for everything. For the pie, for the woman, for the long, lonely night. And then he lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a kiss of desperation, of starvation. It was the kiss of a man who had been drowning for years and had just found a lungful of air. It was rough and hungry, tasting of whiskey and sorrow and a loneliness so profound it was a physical ache. Abigail met his hunger with her own, a quiet, deep well of longing she hadn't known she possessed. Her arms went around his neck, her fingers tangling in his rough hair, and she held on as if he were the only solid thing in a spinning world. They moved from the floor to the bed, their desperate, fumbling journey a testament to the urgency of their need. They shed their clothes not with practiced ease, but with a clumsy haste, tearing down the final barriers that had stood between them. What happened that night, in the quiet, dusty cabin, was not about lust. It was a more fundamental, more human craving. It was two people, scarred and broken by the world in their own ways, finally allowing themselves to be seen. It was a conversation held in the language of touch, a mapping of lonely landscapes. His hands, which had known only the cold steel of a gun, learned the soft, warm geography of her body. He traced the faint web of scars on her face, not with pity, but with a kind of reverence, as if they were the testament to a resilience he could only admire. She, in turn, learned the terrain of his past, her fingers tracing the old, silvery scars on his back and chest, each one a silent story of violence and survival. They came together not in a fiery explosion, but with a kind of desperate, quiet solemnity. It was an affirmation of life in the face of so much death, a moment of profound, shared humanity. It was two solitudes, meeting and merging for a few brief, sacred hours, holding back the vast, indifferent darkness of the world outside. They were not a gunslinger and a widow. They were just a man and a woman, finding a fragile, temporary salvation in each other's arms. The days that followed were transformed. A quiet peace settled over the cabin, the brittle tension replaced by a soft, warm intimacy. Jedediah's smiles were still rare, but they reached his eyes now. He would walk by her at the hearth, and his hand would come up to brush a stray strand of hair from her cheek, a casual, possessive gesture that made her heart sing. She, in turn, began to hum as she worked. Small, tuneless melodies that filled the cabin with a sound it had never known. Contentment. She smiled more. A real, unburdened smile that softened the sad lines around her eyes and made her plain face almost beautiful. One morning, after breakfast, he stopped at the door before leaving. He turned and placed a small stack of heavy silver coins on the corner of the checkered tablecloth. "For a new dress," he said, his voice gruff with an unfamiliar shyness. "Something nice." Then he was gone before she could reply. Abigail stared at the coins, a warmth spreading through her chest. It was his clumsy, male way of trying to give her something beautiful, to erase the memory of the woman in crimson. She took the coins into town that day, but she did not go to the mercantile. She did not want a new dress. She did not want to be someone else. She went home and pulled an old wooden chest from under her pallet. From it, she took a dress, wrapped carefully in yellowed linen. It was made of simple, cream-colored wool, with a row of tiny, pearl-like buttons down the front. It was her wedding dress. It was worn and faded, and there was a small, ragged tear in the sleeve, from the day she had caught it on a nail while helping to build her husband's coffin. She did not want to replace it. She wanted to reclaim it. She sat in a rocking chair, the cream-colored wool spread across her lap, and with a needle and thread, she began to mend the tear. Her stitches were small and neat, a line of careful, healing marks. She was not mending the dress for a dead husband or for the man who now shared her bed. She was mending it for herself. She was stitching together the torn pieces of her own life, honoring the past while embracing the present. She was Abigail, not just a widow, not just a cook. She was herself, whole and unbroken. The change in them did not go unnoticed in Red Rock. The whispers in the general store and the saloon took on a new tone. Before, the gossip had been scornful, pitying. Now, it was a strange cocktail of derision, disbelief, and a new, grudging respect. Heard he nearly beat Cletus Miller to death for laying a hand on her. One rancher would mutter into his beer. Seen him myself, another would add. He looks at her like, well, I ain't never seen Jedediah Kane look at anyone like that before. The women's talk was sharper. She thinks she's tamed him. One would sniff. Pride comes before a fall. He's a wolf. He'll turn on her. But beneath the scorn was a sliver of fear. They did not understand what power this plain, quiet woman held over the most dangerous man they knew. They saw a quiet cabin at the end of the trail. And for the first time, they saw it not as a predator's lair, but as a fortress, defended by something more formidable than guns. They didn't have a name for it, but they began to give the cabin, and the strange couple within it, a wider, more respectful berth. The peace they had found was a fragile, living thing, a wildflower growing in the cracks of a rock, and like any beautiful thing in a harsh land, it was destined to attract predators. They came from the east, a band of 5 riders, trailing a reputation as black as a carrion crow's wing. They were led by a man named Silas Kane, a name Jedediah knew from a past life. Kane was a man with a jackal's smile and eyes that were cold, empty holes. He and his men were not just thieves. They were butchers, men who killed for the sport of it. And they had a long-standing, blood-soaked score to settle with Jedediah Kane. They didn't ride into Red Rock shouting threats. Their arrival was quiet, almost sinister. They took rooms at the boarding house, drank silently at the saloon, and their presence settled over the town like a shroud. But word traveled on the dusty air, passed in whispers between nervous townsfolk. They were asking about Jedediah Kane. The news came to the cabin via the general store's proprietor, a man who, despite his dislike of Jedediah, feared Silas Kane far more. He rode his wagon out to the end of the trail, his face pale with sweat that had nothing to do with the heat. "Kane," he said, refusing to get down from his seat. "Silas Kane is in town. He and 4 others. They're asking for you." Jedediah, who had been repairing the roof patch from the storm, slowly straightened up, a hammer in his hand. He looked past the proprietor, his gaze fixed on the distant, hazy shape of the town. Abigail, who had come to the door, felt a cold dread wash over her as she saw the look on his face. The softness was gone. The quiet contentment of the past weeks vanished as if it had never been. In its place was the old, hard mask of the gunslinger, the cold, calculating stillness of a predator that has scented a threat. "I know," Jedediah said, his voice a low rumble. "They mean to kill you," the proprietor stammered. "The sheriff, he ain't getting involved. Says it's your business." "It is," Jedediah said. He turned and looked at Abigail, and his eyes held a cold finality that terrified her. "Thank you for the warning. Miller, now get back to town. Bar your doors." The proprietor needed no further encouragement, whipping his mule into a trot and leaving them in a cloud of dust. Abigail ran to Jedediah, her hands clutching at his strong, solid arm. "What will you do?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "What I have to," he said, his gaze still distant. "This isn't a debt that can be paid with coin." "Then we'll leave," she said, her words a frantic plea. "We can leave right now, pack what we can and ride west. They'll never find us." He finally looked down at her, and his hard expression softened with a deep, aching sadness. He reached out and cupped her face in his calloused hand, his thumb stroking the scarred skin of her cheek. "Abigail," he said, her name a prayer on his lips. "There is no running from this. Men like Kane, they don't stop. They'd hunt us to the sea, they'd find us, and they would destroy everything." He looked around. at the small, sturdy cabin, at the checkered cloth visible on the table through the open door, at the wisp of smoke rising from their chimney. This place, this quiet, it's the only thing I've ever had that was worth a damn. I will not let them touch it. I will not let them touch you. His decision was absolute. He was not going to fight for his old, stained honor. He was going to fight for his new, clean life. He was going to fight for her. The understanding of what he meant to do dawned on her, and it was a horrifying sunrise. "No," she said, shaking her head, her eyes wide with terror. "No, you cannot face them alone. There are 5 of them." "It's the only way," he said grimly. "Then I will go with you," she declared, her fear solidifying into a fierce, protective resolve. "I can load a rifle. I will not hide in here while you—" She couldn't finish the sentence. He gave her a sad, weary smile. "I know you would," he said softly. "That's why I can't let you." He moved with a sudden, swift purpose that took her by surprise. He took her by the arm, his grip firm but not cruel, and led her inside the cabin. He walked her to the trap door of the root cellar. "No, Jedediah, please!" she begged, pulling back, her feet scrambling for purchase on the floorboards. "Don't do this! Don't shut me away! Let me stand with you!" "I am doing this to protect you," he said, his voice raw with an agony she could now understand. It was the agony of a man forced to use his brute strength to protect the very thing he loved from himself and the world he came from. He pulled open the heavy door. "Go down." "No," she cried, her voice breaking. His face was a mask of torment. "Abigail, please, don't make this harder." He grabbed her by the waist, and, though she struggled, he lifted her as easily as a child and lowered her into the darkness of the cellar. She landed on the packed earth floor, stumbling. Before she could recover, he was closing the door. She saw his face for a last, fleeting second in the rectangle of light, his eyes full of a terrible, unspoken goodbye. Then the door slammed shut, plunging her into absolute blackness. She heard the scrape of a heavy object being dragged across the floor above, followed by the sickening, final thud of the iron bar dropping into place on the outside. He had locked her in. She was a prisoner in the dark. While the man she loved walked out to meet his death, she screamed his name until her throat was raw, her fists beating against the unyielding wood of the trap door. But her only answer was the muffled sound of his footsteps walking away. And then, silence. The fight did not happen in the single, dusty street of Red Rock. Jedediah was not a fool. He was a hunter. He went to them, but on his own terms. He circled around the town, using the gullies and rock outcroppings for cover, and came up behind the livery stable where he knew they'd be tending to their horses. The ensuing battle was not a noble duel. It was a chaotic, brutal, and bloody piece of business. Gunshots exploded in the still afternoon air, sharp, deafening cracks that sent birds scattering into the sky and the townsfolk diving for cover. In the cellar, Abigail heard them, and each shot was a physical blow, a spike of ice through her heart. Jedediah moved like a ghost, a blur of deadly efficiency. He took one of Cain's men down from the cover of a water trough. A single, clean rifle shot. Another fell as he came around the corner of the smithy, not even seeing where the bullet came from. But they were seasoned killers, and they quickly spread out, using the buildings for cover, their return fire splintering the wooden walls around him. A bullet tore through the fleshy part of his left shoulder, spinning him around and sending a shock wave of fiery pain through his body. He gritted his teeth, took cover behind a stack of barrels, and switched to his revolver. He was bleeding, but his hand was steady. He caught a third man reloading in the open doorway of the saloon and put 2 rounds in his chest. Now it was just him, Silas Cain, and one other. They had him pinned down. They worked together, one laying down covering fire while the other tried to flank him. A bullet ricocheted off a horseshoe hanging by the smithy, and a sliver of hot metal sliced open his cheek, the same one that already bore a scar. He tasted his own blood. He knew he couldn't stay where he was. In a desperate gamble, he burst from cover, firing as he ran, and dove through the open door of the livery. The hay-filled air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and fear. He landed hard, the impact jarring his wounded shoulder, and rolled behind a stack of hay bales. His pursuers followed him in, their boots crunching on the straw-strewn floor. The final part of the fight was close and ugly. He shot the fourth man as he came through the door, but not before the man got off a shot of his own. A wild, desperate round that caught Jedediah low in the side, a deep, gut-wrenching blow that took his breath away. He staggered, a wave of blackness threatening to pull him under. Through the haze of pain, he saw Silas Kane step over his fallen man, that jackal's smile finally in place. End of the line. Kane. Kane snarled, raising his pistol. Jedediah had no more bullets in his revolver. With a roar that was more animal than human, he threw the empty gun at Kane's head and lunged, tackling him around the waist. They crashed to the floor, a tangle of limbs and fury. The gun went skittering away into the hay. It came down to fists and knives. Kane was strong, but Jedediah was fueled by a desperate, primal rage. He was fighting for the woman locked in the cellar. He was fighting for the scent of baking bread and the sight of a checkered tablecloth. He was fighting for home. The fight ended with Jedediah's hunting knife. He drove it home with the last of his strength, and Silas Kane's malevolent life gurgled out of him onto the dirty straw of the livery floor. For a long time, Jedediah lay there, gasping for breath, the world a spinning, gray blur. He had won. He had killed them all. But the cost had been immense. He was bleeding from at least 3 places, and the fire in his side was an all-consuming agony. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that he was dying. Somehow, he found the will to stand. He had to get back. He had to let her out. Leaning on the wall, he stumbled out of the livery, a ghost of a man leaving a tomb behind him. His journey back to the cabin was a surreal, stumbling nightmare. Every step was a fresh wave of agony. He left a trail of blood in the dust. He fell twice, and twice he dragged himself back to his feet, his mind fixed on a single image, Abigail's face, waiting in the dark. When he finally reached the cabin, he could go no further. He managed to shove the bar from the trap door, his vision swimming, before he collapsed, his last ounce of strength gone. In the cellar, the gunshots had stopped a long time ago. The ensuing silence was, if possible, even more terrifying. Abigail had used an old, rusty spade she found in the corner, ramming it again and again into the crack of the trap door. The wood was thick, the lock sturdy, but her fear and desperation gave her a strength she didn't know she possessed. Just as she was about to give up, her body aching and her hands raw and splintered, she heard the scrape of the bar being lifted. Sobbing with relief, she pushed the door open and scrambled out, and then she saw him. He was lying in a pool of his own blood, his face the color of ash, his breathing a shallow, rattling whisper. The sight shattered her. This was not like the last time. A clean wound to be tended. This was a man who had been torn apart. Jedediah! The name was a raw, guttural scream, torn from the deepest part of her soul. She fell to her knees beside him, her hands hovering over his ruined body, not knowing where to touch, where to start. Tears streamed down her face, hot and blinding. "Oh, God! Jedediah, no! No!" She ripped strips from her own petticoat, her hands moving with a frantic, clumsy urgency. She tried to staunch the bleeding from the wound in his side, but the blood just welled up around the cloth, dark and terrifyingly plentiful. She washed his face, her tears mingling with the water and the blood. She called his name over and over, as if the sound of her voice alone could be an anchor to keep him from drifting away into the darkness. His eyes flickered open. They were glassy with fever and pain, and they didn't seem to see her. He was delirious, his mind wandering in the twilight country between life and death. His lips moved, forming words that were little more than a breath of sound. "Abigail, he whispered, his gaze fixed on the ceiling. Safe, he coughed. A terrible, wet sound, and a fleck of blood appeared at the corner of his mouth. He seemed to be looking for her, his head turning weakly from side to side. And then his eyes found hers, and, for a moment, a flicker of lucidity, of recognition, passed through them. A faint, heartbreakingly sad smile touched his lips. Love you, he breathed. I love you, Abigail. The words, so simple, so long awaited, struck her with the force of a physical blow. He had never spoken of love. He had shown it in his own rough, silent way, but he had never said the words, and now he was saying them as he was leaving her. A great, shuddering sob racked her body. She leaned in close, her lips next to his ear, her tears falling onto his pale, cold skin. She had to answer him. She had to give him a promise, a reason to stay. Her voice was a fierce, broken whisper, a vow made in the face of death itself. I am not pretty, Jedediah, she whispered, her words a deliberate, powerful echo of their beginning, now transformed into a pledge of a future. But I will live to cook for you until you are old. Do you hear me? You will not die. I will not let you. She worked through the long night, a desperate, one-woman battle against the encroaching darkness. She cleaned his wounds, stitched the worst of them with a needle and thread from her sewing basket, her tears often blurring her vision so she could barely see. She boiled herbs to fight the fever that was now raging through him, forcing the bitter liquid between his lips. Sometime in the deepest, darkest hour before dawn, when his breathing was at its shallowest and his skin was cold and clammy to the touch, she thought she had lost him. She sat on the floor beside him, his head in her lap, and simply wept, her hope completely gone. In her despair, she picked up his shirt, the one he had been wearing. It was stiff with dried blood and torn from the fight. She took her sewing basket and, with the numb, trembling fingers, she began to mend the torn sleeve. It was a mad, irrational act, an act of pure, unadulterated love. She could not stitch his flesh back together. She could not command his heart to keep beating, but she could mend the cloth that had covered him. She could perform this one small, domestic act of restoration in the face of utter destruction. She sat there, in the flickering lamplight, weeping silently as she made tiny, perfect stitches, sewing a piece of his life back together while the whole of it threatened to unravel completely. As the first light of dawn crept into the cabin, he stirred. His eyes opened. The fever had broken. They were no longer glassy, but clear, though filled with a profound weariness. He looked up at her, saw her tear-stained face, the sewing in her lap, and the utter devotion that radiated from her like a physical warmth. He saw that she had not left his side for a single second. He tried to speak, but his throat was too dry. He lifted his hand, a weak, trembling gesture. She immediately dropped the shirt and took his hand in both of hers, holding it to her cheek. It was so cold. He squeezed her fingers, a faint, barely there pressure. He licked his dry, cracked lips and tried again. His voice was a thread of sound, a fragile whisper in the quiet room. Don't need, he started, his voice catching. He took a shallow, painful breath. He looked directly into her eyes, and the love he had confessed in his delirium was there now, quiet, lucid, and absolute. I don't need pretty, he whispered. I need you, here. Jedediah's recovery was a slow, arduous journey back from the brink. The first week was a fever dream of pain and shadow, a landscape he navigated only by the sound of Abigail's voice and the cool touch of her hand on his brow. She was his constant, his anchor in the raging storm of his own mortality. She spoon-fed him broth, cleaned his wounds with a grim determination that belied her gentle nature, and sat by his side through the long, silent nights, mending his torn clothes as if she could mend his broken body by sheer force of will. As the fever receded and the sharpest edges of pain dulled to a persistent, heavy ache, a new kind of life began in the small cabin. It was a life lived in a quiet, circumscribed world, bounded by the log walls and the small patch of land around them. The town of Red Rock, with its ghosts and its gossip, ceased to exist for them. Their universe had shrunk to the size of a sick room, and in that small space, it had become infinite. When Jedediah could finally stand, he was a gaunt, unsteady version of his former self. He moved with the careful, deliberate motions of an old man, his body a map of fresh scars layered over the old. But with each passing day, a little more strength returned. He began by sitting in the sun, then taking a few steps to the woodpile, then a few more. His first real act of recovery was to take up his tools and begin repairing the small, dilapidated animal pen at the back of the cabin. His movements were slow, his breath often catching with a fresh twinge of pain from the wound in his side, but he worked with a steady, quiet resolve. He was not just rebuilding a pen, he was rebuilding a life, a future. He was building a place for something to grow. While he worked with wood and nails, Abigail worked with the earth. In the rich soil behind the cabin, she cultivated a garden with a fierce and loving attention. She planted rows of beans, squash, and hardy greens, her hands covered in the dark, life-giving dirt. The garden became her domain, a small, ordered patch of green in the vast, sun-scorched brownness of the prairie. It was a testament to her belief in the future, a promise of sustenance and continuity. Their days fell into a new rhythm, a silent, comfortable dance of domesticity. He would work on his projects, and she would tend her garden or her kitchen. They spoke little, but their communication had evolved beyond the need for words. A shared glance across the yard, the simple act of her bringing him a dipper of cool water, his hand resting on the small of her back as they passed in the narrow cabin doorway. These were their new language. Their nights were filled with a quiet, tender intimacy, a rediscovery of each other not in a fever of desperation, but in a slow, deep, and abiding affection. The ghosts of their pasts were still there, but their shadows seemed to have grown fainter, pushed back by the steady, warm light of the life they were building together. They had found a fragile, beautiful peace, and they were fools to think it would last. The law arrived on a crisp autumn morning. It came not with guns and fury, but in the form of a single, tired-looking man on a dusty bay horse. He wore a star on his vest, but it was tarnished, and his face was etched with the weary lines of a man who had seen too much of the territories. He was a U.S. Marshal, following a trail that had gone cold years ago. A trail of warrants and witness accounts from a life Jedediah had tried to bury. He dismounted and approached the cabin with a caution born of experience, his hand resting near the butt of his pistol. Jedediah, who had been sanding a new axe handle, slowly set it down. Abigail came to the doorway, wiping her flour-dusted hands on her apron, a sudden, cold premonition clutching at her heart. "Jedediah Kane?" the marshal asked, his voice flat and official. "That's me," Jedediah replied, his own voice quiet. There was no defiance in it, only a profound, bone-deep weariness. He had been running from this day his entire life, and now that it was here, all he felt was tired. The marshal pulled a folded, official-looking document from his coat pocket. "I have a warrant for your arrest, for crimes committed in the Nebraska Territory. Specifically, the deaths of 3 men during a stagecoach robbery in '78. He looked from Jedediah's impassive face to Abigail's, and a flicker of something like pity crossed his features. "A circuit judge is passing through Red Rock. You're to stand trial." Abigail felt the world tilt on its axis. The garden, the rebuilt pen, the warm scent of baking bread. It all dissolved into a meaningless dream. The past had reached out with a long, bony hand and was about to drag them under. "No," she whispered, the word a small, lost sound in the vast quiet. Jedediah didn't move. He just looked at the marshal, a man doing a job, and gave a single, slow nod. "I'll come quiet," he said. The trial was a spectacle. The judge, a stern, white-bearded man named Abernathy, convened the court in the saloon, the only building in Red Rock large enough to hold the crowd. The entire town was there, their faces a mixture of fear, morbid curiosity, and a grim sort of satisfaction. They were finally going to see the monster brought to justice. Jedediah stood before the judge, flanked by two of the marshal's deputies. He was not in chains, a small concession from the weary marshal who had seen the way Jedediah had looked at his wife. He stood tall, his face a stony mask, his eyes fixed on some point beyond the room. He looked like the killer they had all imagined him to be. The prosecution presented its case, a dry recitation of names and dates, of a violent past that felt like a story about another man entirely. Witnesses were called, old men with faded memories who spoke of the fearsome reputation of the Kane gang. The evidence was damning, a mountain of old sins. Jedediah offered no defense. He did not speak a single word in his own favor. He simply stood and accepted the weight of his past. It seemed hopeless. Abigail sat in the front row, her hands twisted together in her lap, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. She watched the man she loved being condemned, and she felt a rage build within her, a fierce, protective anger that burned away her fear. When the judge asked if the defense had any final witnesses, Abigail stood up. "I will speak," she said, her voice small but clear in the suddenly silent room. Every head turned to look at her. The plain, quiet woman who cooked for the killer. A murmur went through the crowd. Judge Abernathy looked down at her over his spectacles, his expression severe. "And who are you, madam?" "I am Abigail," she said, lifting her chin. "And I live with him." She walked to the front of the room, her worn boots making a soft, lonely sound on the dusty floorboards. She stood before the judge, her hands clasped before her, a small, drab sparrow in a room full of hawks. She was terrified. Her knees were weak, her voice threatening to tremble into silence. But then she looked at Jedediah. He was watching her, and for the first time that day, a flicker of emotion crossed his face, a desperate plea for her not to do this, not to tie herself to his sinking ship. That look gave her all the strength she needed. "Your Honor," she began, her voice gaining a surprising, steady strength. "I know what you all see when you look at him. You see the stories you've been told. You see a killer." She took a deep breath. "I don't know that man. The man I know came to my door a stranger and gave me shelter when I had nothing. I was starving, and he fed me." She glanced at the faces in the crowd, at the women who had whispered about her, at the men who had feared him. "You say he is a violent man. I have seen his violence. I saw him strike a man in this town for laying a hand on me. But I also saw his face afterwards. I saw that he hated what he had done. I saw a man who was ashamed of the very strength that you all fear." Her voice began to tremble now, not with fear, but with the force of her conviction. "When I was sick with a fever, so sick I thought I would die, he carried me to his own bed. He nursed me. This man you call a monster, he saved my life." She paused, her gaze sweeping the room before landing back on the judge. "And a month ago, when Silas Kane and his gang came to this town, men who would have robbed and killed you all without a second thought, who stood against them? Your sheriff didn't. You all hid behind your barred doors. He did. Jedediah fought them. He fought them alone, to protect this town, to protect his home." Tears were now streaming freely down her face, but she didn't bother to wipe them away. "He was nearly killed doing it. I watched him bleed on our floor. And I know why he did it. He did it because he is not the man he used to be. He is a man who has learned the value of peace. He is a man who has changed." She looked directly at Jedediah, her heart in her eyes. He was changed by love. She finished, her small speech hanging in the thick, stunned silence of the saloon. It was a simple, honest testament, a woman's truth against a man's history. Jedediah stood with his head bowed, his shoulders shaking with a silent, contained emotion. The town was split. Some saw only the past, a debt of blood that had to be paid, but others, the ones who had seen him in the store, the ones who had heard the gunshots of his battle with Cain's gang, the ones who saw the fierce, unshakable devotion on Abigail's plain face, began to see something else. They saw the possibility of redemption. Judge Abernathy was a man of the law, but he was also a man of the West. He had seen his share of hard men, and he knew a true change when he saw one. He could not ignore the warrants, the sworn testimony. But he also could not ignore the truth he had just heard in Abigail's trembling voice. He banged his gavel. "This court finds Jedediah Cain guilty of the crimes of his past," he announced, his voice booming in the quiet room. A grim finality settled over the crowd. "However," the judge continued, holding up a hand, "this court also recognizes that a man's past is not the entire measure of his soul. In light of his recent actions in defense of this community, and in light of the testimony we have just heard, I am exercising judicial discretion." He looked directly at Jedediah. "I sentence you to a life of peace. You are to be pardoned of these crimes, on one condition, that you leave this territory by sunrise tomorrow and never return. The past will be considered paid, but it must be left behind." A collective gasp went through the room. It was not justice, not in the traditional sense. It was a compromise. It was a chance. It was exile. They left that night, under the cold, indifferent light of 1,000 stars. They packed little, a few clothes, her mending basket, his tools, and enough food for a week's journey. Everything else, the cabin, the tablecloth, the garden with its sleeping plants, they left behind. As they stood in the doorway for the last time, Abigail's hand found his. He squeezed it tightly, his anchor in a world that was once again adrift. They mounted their horses and, without looking back, rode west, away from the only home they had ever known together. They rode for 2 days, speaking little, the vast, empty plains a reflection of the emptiness they felt at their loss. On the 3rd day, as the sun reached its zenith, they stopped to rest in the shade of a lone, ancient cottonwood tree, a solitary giant in the endless sea of grass. Jedediah sat with his back against the thick, gnarled trunk, his eyes closed, his face etched with weariness. Abigail rummaged in her saddlebag. She had baked the morning they left, a final, ritualistic act in her beloved kitchen. She pulled out a small, golden brown hand pie, its crust still flaky. She had made it with the last of her preserved peaches. She held it out to him. He opened his eyes and looked at it, then at her. She gave him a small, watery smile, her heart so full it felt like it might break. "I don't know if I'm beautiful," she said, her voice a soft, quiet whisper against the sigh of the wind in the cottonwood leaves. Her words brought the entire circle of their story to a close, not with a plea for survival, but with a vow of unwavering devotion. "But as long as you keep eating this," she continued, her gaze locked with his, "I'll keep living to make it." Jedediah looked at her plain, scarred face, at the strength and the love that shone from her eyes, and he knew he was looking at the most beautiful thing he had ever seen in his entire wretched life. A slow, gentle smile touched his lips, a smile of pure, unadulterated peace. He took the pie from her, his fingers brushing against hers. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He leaned forward and pressed a soft, lingering kiss to her forehead. It was a kiss of reverence, of gratitude, a promise of a future, a seal on their shared soul. It was a gentle, hopeful benediction in the middle of a sun-scorched, unforgiving wilderness. When he pulled back, he took a bite of the pie, and its sweetness filled his mouth. He looked out at the horizon, a vast, empty canvas stretching before them. Abigail sat beside him, leaning her head on his shoulder. and they shared the small pie in the quiet shade of the ancient tree. The story closes there, with the image of two small, solitary figures on horseback, their shadows long behind them, riding steadily toward a blazing red horizon. They were riding away from a past of blood and sorrow, and toward a future they would build together, armed with nothing but a stubborn, quiet love and the promise of another meal, another day, another life, a new beginning. Thank you for listening to our story tonight around the Wild West Campfire. We'd love to know where you're tuning in from. So, drop a comment below and let's connect. Please consider subscribing to the Wild West Campfire channel for more tales from the frontier, and share your thoughts on Jedediah and Abigail's journey.